Hi, everyone. Welcome to Building Back Better with People-Centered Infrastructure, a virtual event on job creation, workforce development, and an inclusive economic recovery. I'm Katie Spiker, Director of Government Affairs at National Skills Coalition. And to kick us off, the CEO of National Skills Coalition, Andy Van Glunden.
Thanks, Katie. For the past several months, President Biden has often talked about how it is that we need to rebuild the backbone of America to get us thinking about economic growth in the terms that we used to think about them in the late 20th century. And that's had a lot to do with the infrastructure conversation that he's put forward and in some of the proposals that have come out in the recently proposed American Jobs Plan. Over the last half of the 20th century, a lot of the ways that the US became a leader in the world economy was we invested a lot in world-class transportation systems, in building new public utilities to better serve local communities. And we had the most skilled workforce in the world in construction and manufacturing, and later on in healthcare and information technology. And it was those kind of combined investments in physical infrastructure and human infrastructure that really helped us stay ahead of the global economy. But in decades recently, we kind of lost track of that kind of strategy for economic growth. We've had a lot of conversation about the physical infrastructure that is now crumbling all throughout the US. So the bridges and roads that are falling down, the water utilities that are not just functioning, but actually are unsafe for local community residents, the energy transmission systems we have that are not keeping pace with current technology. The airports and seaports that are not really functioning effectively to move goods in and out of this country, as well as people. And certainly all of the school buildings and other housing stock that is falling down without having a set of ready-made ways to reinvest in that stock to build it back up to 21st century standards. And this has been an animating issue for both Democrats and Republicans in Washington for years. But thankfully, we hope that this year, with the introduction of the American Jobs Plan, we're going to have an opportunity to actually have a real discussion about how to address some of that crumbling physical infrastructure in the US and to bring us up to the standards that we think is necessary for us to continue to be a leader in the world economy. But the other part of the conversation that we think still has not been talked about enough is that human infrastructure, the investments in the people that were part of that success story back in the 20th century, and we think are going to have to be part of any infrastructure conversation that we're having here in the US in the 21st century. It's those backbone jobs that the workers who are doing building that kind of infrastructure, people who are working in jobs that didn't necessarily require a four-year degree, but certainly were working in skilled careers and having to retrain over time to make sure that they were staying ahead of the technological curve. Those are the kinds of workers and jobs that we really have left behind in our nation's education and economic policies over the past couple decades. And that was one of the reasons why National Skills Coalition was created, to lift up those jobs, to lift up those workers, and to talk about the kinds of policies that we need to make those pathways real for those workers in those industries to keep them current with our competitors in the rest of the world. And that's something that we're hoping is going to be a part of the infrastructure conversation moving forward. And thankfully, there are some proposals to do that in the context of the American Jobs Plan. We're going to talk a bit about that today, to kind of like what we think is going to be necessary to make sure that that's part of the plan that we see coming out of Congress and signed by the president, hopefully before the end of the year. And those kinds of investments in people couldn't be more important than now, when we are still in the depths of the COVID-19 recession. Last year, in the height of the recession, National Skills Coalition put out Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery to talk about the tens of millions of workers who we know are going to need some investment in their skills to be part of how it is they're going to get back into this economy when it gets back on track after the pandemic. When you take all the folks who are currently receiving unemployment insurance, plus those who permanently left the workforce, we still have over 20 million working Americans who don't know what their pathway is going to be back into the labor market. And we believe a better and more progressive set of education and training policies could be part of that solution. Our Skills for an Inclusive Economic Recovery agenda, which looks at job training and infrastructure and job creation and higher education and social safety net policies and a range of other policy areas, are all driven by a certain set of basic principles that we hope are going to animate the infrastructure debate we're going to have in Washington for the rest of this year. How is it that we invest in the people first who've been most impacted by this recession? How can we take a look at structural racism that is impacting a whole set of workers, not just in terms of their prospects in the labor market, but even in the structure and the operation of the education and training policies that we currently offer them? How is it that we're going to know that we're making sure that we're not just getting folks their first job coming out of the recession, but they're actually on a pathway towards a long-term career that's going to take them well into the 21st century? Where is it that we can bring business partnerships together with other stakeholders to make sure that every job that we're training folks for has a real employer with a real pathway connected to it, and making sure that those partnerships are the animating way that we think about workforce development in this country moving forward? And making sure that we are measuring and reporting on who's being served and is not being served effectively by our policies, and who is and is not being included in the economic recovery coming out of this recession. And looking particularly at racial equity, gender equity, the prospects of workers who have been concentrated in downsizing industries, the prospects of workers who are in the labor market currently without a BA or working at a low wage job. Those are the folks that we want to make sure are included, not just in what happens with our infrastructure plan moving forward, but with every other policy that's coming out in the context of economic recovery coming from Washington over the next year or so. I'm really excited about all the range of stakeholders who have been a part of coming up with that agenda: the business and labor leaders, the community colleges and community organizations, the workforce boards and other workforce intermediaries and sector partnership leaders, the local elected officials, all of who have come around thinking about how it is that we can think about infrastructure planning and workforce planning in general, driven by some of those principles that I just laid out. I want to give special thanks to some of the members of our industry recovery panels who have been helping us think about recovery strategy in the context of specific industries. Those include recovery panels in the areas of infrastructure and manufacturing. You'll hear from some of those folks today in the context of the panel discussion that Katie's going to lead us through. So I'm really interested to hear what they've got to say about some of these issues. And I'm really excited about working with all of you to try to make sure that by the end of this year, we have a truly people-centered infrastructure plan that's going to be good for those workers, it's going to be good for those industries, and it's going to make sure that we're going to have effective and healthy communities for everybody in this country moving forward. So looking forward to today's conversation. Now let me turn things back over to Katie.
Thanks, Andy. Before we get to an analysis of the Biden administration's infrastructure and jobs plan, let's hear from a couple members of Congress who have been strong workforce development champions and leaders in the infrastructure and skills conversation.
Hey everyone, Senator Tim Kaine here in my office in the Russell Building. I want to thank you for inviting me to say a few words about your discussion on skills training for infrastructure jobs. I am so excited right now, and I know you are too, that the Biden administration wants to do a $1.5 trillion investment in American infrastructure. This is way overdue. We're in critical need of an infrastructure upgrade. In February, the American Society of Civil Engineers graded 11 infrastructure categories in this country as D+ or worse. And that's no surprise. We've seen their reports earlier. Systems across this country are in dire need of repair: bridges, public transit, roads, school, water, and sewer systems. Even without a significant investment, though, we currently lack the workforce training to meet the need to rebuild our infrastructure. And if we're going to do a significant investment, we have to have the skilled workers to complete these projects so that our economy can benefit for decades. While the need to invest in infrastructure goes back decades, there is now renewed momentum today, especially because around 10 million people continue to remain unemployed in the aftermath of COVID-19. The job losses are exacerbating historic inequities that have limited opportunities for women and people of color. So if we're going to do an infrastructure bill, particularly coming out of COVID, we've got to invest in workforce training as a key part of that bill. I'm pleased to introduce today with bipartisan colleagues the Building U.S. Infrastructure by Leveraging Demand for Skills Act. The acronym is the Builds Act. My colleague in the Senate, Rob Portman, my co-chair on the Senate Career and Technical Education Caucus, we've put this bill together with advice from many stakeholders, and we're excited to introduce it. It would create a grant program to support industry and sector partnerships that work with local governments, local businesses, labor organizations, and other partners engaged in their communities to encourage industry growth and the collaboration to improve worker training and advancement in these targeted infrastructure fields. As we prepare to tackle this critical infrastructure challenge in the months ahead, it's vital that workforce not be an afterthought, but be basically included as a core component of the bill. The bill will help foster strong industry partnerships and career pathways in infrastructure fields to ensure we can train and upskill the workers we need for millions of good paying jobs. It's an exciting time. As a former mayor and governor, I know that officials all across this country have been waiting finally for an infrastructure investment. We can do it in ways that strengthen both the economy, individuals' lives, and our education system. That's what the Builds Act is about.
Hello, I'm Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici from Northwest Oregon. Thank you for your advocacy and leadership on workforce issues. We are in an unprecedented economic and health crisis, and workers are on the front lines. According to the Department of Labor, about 4 million people are now classified as long-term unemployed after being out of work for more than 6 months, and that total is likely an undercount. Workforce development systems are tasked with providing workers, particularly those with barriers to employment, with the skills they need for meaningful jobs. At this time, as we build back better, we must help unemployed individuals access the job training they need to re-enter the workforce. Additionally, any investment to improve our nation's infrastructure and to transition to a clean energy economy has the potential to create millions of new jobs, requiring skilled workers to fill them. But infrastructure investments have not always been paired with the support for training and services that can help individuals get the skills they need to participate in these new jobs. I'm working to advance my Bipartisan Builds Act, which will help increase diversity in the transportation, infrastructure, and energy sectors. The Builds Act will provide support services and training that will help workers succeed and find better paying jobs through pre-employment services, early employment support, and continuing employment services. I'm glad the bill passed the House last year as part of our Moving Forward infrastructure package, and I'm working to advance it now as part of the American Jobs Plan. Thank you again for your leadership. I look forward to our continued work together.
Thanks to Senator Kaine and Congressman Bonamici for those messages of support. As Andy and the two members of Congress talked about, infrastructure can be the key to putting millions of people back to work in jobs for which businesses are hiring, but not without investing in the training to get them there. National Skills Coalition and our partners have been calling for a significant investment in workforce development as part of any jobs and infrastructure plan. Just last month, we sent a letter signed by almost 80 state and national organizations to the Biden administration, calling on them to make a $100 billion commitment to training in their recovery package that is dedicated to ensuring workers who lost their jobs have access to skills training and supports to reskill for new jobs, to support the capacity of our public workforce, career and technical and adult education systems to respond to unprecedented business demand and worker need, and to support the upskilling of workers most in need of new skills to stay in the workforce, including through their digital literacy skills. And $100 billion is exactly what we saw in the American Jobs Plan. The recently released proposal, a more than $2 trillion package aimed at putting people back to work, rebuilding every corner of our nation's infrastructure, including manufacturing and green energy jobs, called for $100 billion for proven workforce development programs targeted at underserved groups. These investments are split into 3 categories of proposals in the American Jobs Plan, which would target underserved communities and seek to advance racial equity across each of these 3 bullets. First, a $40 billion investment in comprehensive supports for dislocated workers. This investment specifically targeted to sector-based training and to support services like income support, childcare, and transportation that workers who have lost their jobs need to reskill and be successful in those training programs. Next, there's a $12 billion investment in programs for subsidized jobs. And finally, there's a $48 billion investment in expanding the capacity of the existing workforce development, CTE, and adult ed systems. These investments would support community college training and partnership and capacity at community colleges consistent with the TACT program, ensuring that community colleges can provide successful training for in-demand jobs and targeted investments in pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs. It also includes funding for expanded career services and adult literacy. Now, how can Congress realize this vision? First, we need to do exactly what the American Jobs Plan does: center workforce development within the infrastructure conversation. Too often in past infrastructure stimulus packages from previous recessions, investments in human capital and physical infrastructure have been bifurcated. That means that experts at job training and preparing workers at the local level aren't given the opportunity to be part of the conversations happening about project scoping or about building roads and bridges. Once these two are combined, Congress should propose using this $100 billion to ensure those connections happen at the local level, ensure that our public workforce system has the funding to support training and to provide support services for workers. This investment also needs to empower businesses, especially small and mid-sized companies, to upskill and reskill new and existing workers to meet increased and evolving demand. Just last week, we saw the introduction of the Bipartisan Builds Act in the House and Senate, which would invest in partnerships at the local level to ensure that workers have access to training and can succeed in that training. It would also provide an on-ramp for workers into permanent jobs, subsidizing wages for new hires over the first few months. This lead time means businesses have increased capacity to hire workers and invest in even further upskilling, while still ensuring workers access to in-demand credentials and long-term employment. The Builds Act would support pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship training and other on-the-job learning opportunities for workers who need to reskill for infrastructure jobs. Next, these investments need to be targeted to ensure workers who have been historically excluded from good infrastructure jobs, like women and people of color, have access to training for projects that are built in their neighborhoods. Local hire provisions may require contractors to hire a certain portion of their workforce from the local area. We need to make sure that workers aren't excluded from good jobs because they haven't been given the opportunity to develop the necessary skills. Congressman Stephen Horsford is working on a proposal calling for infrastructure professional opportunity grants. This proposal is based on the success of a grant program that helped broaden the pipeline of healthcare workers. And the proposal would target additional training dollars to workers who have had the least access to training and the least access to good infrastructure jobs. Occupational training is critical for workers. And as technology continues to be an even greater mainstay in workplaces, from construction sites to an advanced manufacturing plant to a power utility plant, investments need to be targeted to ensure workers have those occupational skills and digital skills necessary to succeed on the job. True digital access and equity requires access to broadband, including through the investments that we see proposed in the American Jobs Plan, as well as to devices. It also means workers have the skills to use these devices and that they have the chance to develop the digital skills necessary to succeed at work. Congress should ensure dedicated investment in workers' digital skills, in basic digital literacy, as well as the capacity for workers to upskill and reskill to meet industry-specific digital demands on the job. In addition to supporting workers' ability to train, investments also need to support industry's ability to supply that training through on-the-job learning and upskilling opportunities, especially for small and mid-sized companies, and for workers who need more intensive training once they're hired. Congressman Horsford and Congressman Brett Guthrie last Congress introduced the Bipartisan Skill Up Act, which would provide businesses with an up to $10,000 tax credit for hiring workers from target populations, like workers eligible for public benefit programs or long-term unemployed veterans, and for providing these workers with on-the-job learning opportunities. Finally, Congress needs to make college work for working people. One way to do that would be to make Pell Grants available to high-quality short-term programs. Making Pell available for short-term programs would make it easier for unemployed workers to get the financial support needed to earn an industry recognized credential that leads to an in-demand job, or to get new skills for workplaces that were transformed overnight by technological advances driven by the pandemic. The Bipartisan Jobs Act would do just that. Taken together, these strategies, investing in skills training for all workers, targeting investments to workers who have historically been excluded from good infrastructure jobs, support for workers, industry-specific digital reskilling and upskilling, empowering businesses to invest in workers who have the least access to skills training, and modernizing higher education to support greater access to high-quality short-term credentials would transform our country's recovery from one of luck to a truly inclusive economic recovery. Infrastructure and skills is obviously important to National Skills Coalition and our networks. Lots of other national organizations are working on this issue too. And I'm joined today by 4 national experts in skills and infrastructure. Tracy Scott, Vice President of Workforce Development at National Urban League, Stephanie Martinez-Ruckman, Legislative Director, Human Development at National League of Cities, Jason Walsh, Executive Director at BlueGreen Alliance and National Skills Coalition alum, and Cassie Zumbiel, Director, Workforce Initiatives at the Manufacturing Institute. Thank you all for being here. Jason, I'll start with you. Why is it important to the construction and green energy industries and organized labor that skills is part of an infrastructure?
It's a great question. Thanks, Katie. I mean, we are the BlueGreen Alliance is a coalition of labor unions and environmental groups. And they approach skills a little bit differently, right? So for our labor partners, enabling their rank and file members to gain skills is a core part of what they do, because it increases the productivity and bargaining power of those members, which is the primary reason why unions invest money into joint labor management funds with their signatory employers. And those support in the construction sector, registered apprenticeship programs, and other union affiliated training programs outside the construction sector. With our building trades partners in particular, jobs and skills are completely intertwined in that each journey person who is, the graduate of an apprenticeship program starts as an apprentice on the job site and earns while they learn. So it's really core to their business model. For our green partners, our environmental groups, the lens is a little bit different. Obviously, their members and supporters aren't organized on a work site. But I've seen among our environmental groups a growing appreciation of skills training for 2 primary reasons. First, an understanding that skills training done well is central to job access and job quality. For context here, all of our partners, labor and environmental, were part of developing a BlueGreen Alliance policy agenda called Solidarity for Climate Action, which starts from a recognition that we are facing a climate crisis and a crisis of income inequality, which is grounded in systemic economic and racial injustice. And so this issue of job quality and job access is really central to how we approach climate policy and clean energy policy. The second reason, I think, particularly for our environmental groups, that skills is so important is that as we shift to a net zero emissions economy, a clean economy, which we need to do by 2050, will require a massive wave of clean and energy efficiency technology deployment. And if those technologies are not properly manufactured, or installed or operated and maintained, we're not going to achieve that goal.
And we'll hear more on that point about manufacturing workforce from Cassie when we get down to you. Stephanie, what is infrastructure and skills being combined into a package mean for local leaders?
Well, thanks. National League of Cities represents the 19,000 cities, towns, and villages across our country. So from cities as large as New York to our friends in Thurmond, West Virginia, which have 5 residents. And so cities vary in size. Some are urban, some are rural, but have been united on all things, but especially in this last year, as you know, they're on the front lines of fighting the COVID pandemic, as we say, responding, rebuilding, and recovering. We're still responding, but then also thinking about that recovery piece. So infrastructure, I mean, I guess why infrastructure and then why skills, but, you know, infrastructure has long been a concern for city leaders across the country. You know, we know we have a 10-year infrastructure investment gap at about $2.6 trillion. And cities are combating with like revenue shortfalls due to COVID-19 pandemic that has sort of only exacerbated that investment gap, and forcing approximately like 65% of municipalities across the country to delay or completely cancel critical infrastructure projects. So, you know, the infrastructure need is huge. And then combined with that, obviously, we are facing sort of large sort of inequitable impact on workers, especially those without an education past high school, workers of color, women in communities of all sizes. And so we know we can't build infrastructure without people to build and maintain it. And so for us, those things go hand in hand, you know, from an economic development perspective. We want people back in work. We want them, you know, skilled and trained to do the jobs. And we want the infrastructure that can enable people to get to work, to dial into work remotely, and to have safe drinking water, and all of those things. And so for cities, it's a huge, you know, economic development piece. And I think, as you've pointed out, you know, historically as a country, we haven't been very good at combining the investment in skills and workers with the investment in the physical capital infrastructure. And this is a great opportunity for Congress to take a big bite of that apple and to do it all together in the right way.
Thanks, Stephanie. You talked a little bit about both the equity imperative as well as creating opportunities for workers. Tracy, National Urban League and your affiliates work with workers who've been historically excluded from many of the good infrastructure jobs. Can you talk about what a combined infrastructure and skills strategy means for the folks with whom you work?
Sure. Thanks a lot. And thanks for having me on today's panel. I'll start my comments off with a bit of a story. So it was recounted to me that there's a father in his neighborhood walking with his child in hand, and he pointed to a bridge and said, "Your daddy made that bridge." And the sense of pride and belonging really was the central theme of that story. And that's the beauty of what infrastructure jobs do, because while infrastructure is not a unique or siloed issue, it's a very local, personal story. And when we see, particularly for urban communities, due to uneven funding or neglect in that funding and prioritizing it, urban communities feel it so much more intensely than perhaps other communities. And not saying that other communities don't feel the impact of it. Because if we look at issues such as our water, our piping infrastructure and its neglect, we get Flint, Michigan, and overwhelmingly low-income communities of colors suffer more than perhaps others outside of Flint, Michigan. If we look at communities such as the South Bronx or in Queens in New York City, we have crumbling bridges where the trains travel over, and they're literally falling on people and cars that are causing personal issues. And then if you look at in Baltimore, 16,000 homes are crumbling and falling apart. That drives down home equity. It drives down a sense of pride. And again, there's all of this need, and that's where urban communities need it. Now, if we go back to that story of a dad, if African-American communities and other low-income urban communities want to have a fight in changing what their community looks like. And you can do it through protests, you can do it through voting, but you also can do it by being trained and getting jobs in order to literally impact your literal backyard. So when I say we have a dog in the fight, absolutely. And I think we've been chomping at the bit, meaning the African-American community, Latinx community, low-income communities are chomping at the bit to be a part of the solution in a very tangible way.
That's such a good story about the dad and his son. Kelsey, I imagine that your members also hear that a lot from the folks with whom they work about the pride of manufacturing and the production. From a business lens, what does skills as part of an infrastructure mean to your members?
Sure. Well, thank you again for having me today, Katie. So the Manufacturing Institute is the workforce development and education partner to the National Association of Manufacturers. And from a manufacturing perspective, it is critical that skills education is a part of any package going forward. Recruiting and retaining workers continues to be a top challenge that we hear from manufacturers. It has been for quite a while, unfortunately. A few years ago, the Manufacturing Institute, in partnership with Deloitte, released a study that showed that over 2.4 million jobs were expected to go unfilled by 2028 due to the skills gap. And we know that number maybe will change due to COVID. And we will be releasing another report soon in the next couple of months that will look at that number again, but we really don't expect it to greatly change. Just this past month, there were over 538,000 open jobs in manufacturing. With the amount of displaced workers in our country right now and the amount of open jobs in our sector alone, it's really critical that skills in the workforce is a primary focus moving forward.
I am not surprised, but it is interesting to hear all four of you together raising up such similar themes. The role of the need from the both economic development and business perspective, as well as the opportunity and the desire from workers to be able to access these skills so that they can fill good jobs created by an infrastructure package. So it sounds like there's broad agreement around this. Let's talk a little bit about where that agreement sits with policymakers. So Democrats in the administration support this. Infrastructure has always been seen as a bipartisan issue through the years of infrastructure weeks that we have all probably celebrated together. And this seems like something that everyone wants. Senators Kaine and Portman, along with Congressman Bonamici and Congressman Thompson, just introduced the Bipartisan Builds Act, and new Labor Secretary Marty Walsh shared recently how important workforce development was to each of the senators that he talked to around his confirmation hearing. Let's play a clip of his comments around this.
So Secretary Walsh, what will it take to not just create new jobs, but make sure that people want those jobs and have the ability to do them?
Well, that's why I think this a big focus of this plan is on workforce development and also apprenticeships. I think that's what we have to do. I think there's lots of people in this economy that when they lost their job during COVID, they went to another industry to find work in another industry. And in some of those cases, so there's two things going on there in this country, I think, when it comes to employment. But I think workforce development is key. When I was going through my confirmation process, every single senator, just about every single senator, both Republican and Democrat, were laser focused on workforce development. So there is something in this bill for everybody, for their different industries and in their towns that they represent or their states they represent.
So the question is, should workforce development investments be part of how we think about infrastructure? Stephanie, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, it seems as though we've been at it for a long time as local leaders, talking about the need for infrastructure investment, including workforce. It's been a critical part of our, as we call it, Rebuild With Us campaign for 5 years plus. And, there's no, as local leaders like to say, there's no Republican or Democratic potholes. They need to get filled. And whether you fill them with federal money or local money, residents in your communities are expecting that the potholes are filled, that the water comes to their home clean, that the broadband doesn't go out, among the other things, trash pickup, COVID response. And so, cities of large sizes or of small sizes, Republican mayors, Democratic mayors really recognize the need for that infrastructure investment and the need to do it with skilled workers. I'd like to say no one wants to drive over a bridge that someone who isn't trained to build a bridge has built. And so we need to make sure as a country that we're placing value in that system. This is no news to anyone on this panel, but the federal workforce system is underfunded, right? You have been cut nearly 40% over the last 2 decades. And so at a minimum, Congress needs to make sure that that funding is there, but thinking above and beyond that, if we are going to infuse a significant amount of money in the physical infrastructure of our country, how could we do that without making sure that we have the workers to do it? And so I think for local leaders, it goes hand in hand, because when you're sitting there putting the pieces together that come from Washington or come from philanthropy or wherever they come from, you're still trying to solve for one problem, and you can't do it without people, at least not yet.
What about others? What do you see as the bipartisan or the need for thinking about infrastructure and skills?
Yes, so it was great to hear Secretary Walsh talk about manufacturing, because we know manufacturing is so important anything to do with infrastructure. Infrastructure really cannot be successful without the workers with the skills to get it done, which isn't just the people who are building the bridges, but also the workers who are working in manufacturing, who are building the tools necessary to build those bridges as well. And it includes displaced workers as well as youth. It's going to be really important that our youth have the digital skills that are necessary in order to be successful in a manufacturing career as they're continuing to grow and learn about career pathways. So we really believe that skills will be really an important part of infrastructure.
Hearing Secretary Walsh's notation of apprenticeships is very appealing to Urban League and urban communities and low-wage workers. Simply because, one, even just before the pandemic, when we had such historic employment rates, we still had abysmal unemployment rates among low-income and African-American workers. And jobs in the trades or infrastructure jobs present a very wonderful career pathway for either those who are not sure where they want to go, they can't necessarily see themselves in a job. Infrastructure jobs give someone the ability to say, oh, here's a job I can do. We see that in African-American youth, particularly when they're selecting job options, they go for the jobs that they see, that they interact with every day. It's very hard for them to imagine something like being an astronaut because it's not tangible. And so having apprenticeship opportunities for young adults is a wonderful opportunity because then it's out of school, I can get a trade, I can learn while I'm earning, and I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the pressure that low-income families have of trying to make ends meet, and infrastructure union-backed jobs actually help to sustain and bolster income that folks really need today. Not everybody can invest 4 years to sit in class to get the skills they needed. So apprenticeships really work well for our constituents in particular. Also, manufacturing and also in construction are very much welcoming to our re-entry population. And these individuals overwhelmingly indexed as African-American and Latinx, that presents an opportunity for them to find employment, which is an important piece to recidivism. And so for us, we see that being so important as here are tangible, quick ways for you to find solutions for your own personal burdens. So it's really helpful if we think about the report that came out last year that noted that the United States GDP fell, or there was at least 16 trillion loss because we failed to diversify our workforce. And so I think for that indicates that this is a bipartisan priority, that we need to get our economy running, get our economy competitive, and that has to include a diverse workforce and being diverse, not just in jobs, but within the industry up and down the organization itself. And so if you look at it, if we want to, for conservatives, you want safe communities, you want to invest in jobs. If you want to balance your budget, you want to invest in jobs, because investing in jobs means that that's not a young person or a delinquent person taking up a prison bed, because those cost more than investing in job training. So absolutely love it, what Walsh is talking about, and really am very excited for a hopeful, very healthy bill to be passed.
I think it is certainly true that there is support among Republicans and Democrats alike for investments in infrastructure, investments in workforce development. I do think we need to be clear-eyed, though, about what's happening in Congress, right? So despite all of the rhetoric about support for infrastructure, when Republicans controlled the White House and Congress, they didn't get anything passed. And unfortunately, what we've seen in terms of a response from Republican members of Congress to President Biden's America's Jobs Plan suggests that they will not be supportive of this package. So I think we need to continue to engage with Republicans in Congress and continue to make the case. But I think we also need to be realistic that at the end of the day, we may not get many, if any, Republican votes for a package that passes, and that it's going to be perhaps even more important to make sure that the broad and diverse Democratic caucus in both chambers is united around the principle that workforce development investments and infrastructure investments have to go hand in hand.
Well, I hear that as a call to action to all of our networks for the advocacy for ensuring that workforce and skills is part of a package for both Republicans and Democrats. So we have seen, Jason, to your point, Democrats within the administration recognizing the importance of infrastructure and skills together. Secretary Raimondo made recent comments about the importance of workforce in an infrastructure package. Let's listen to her clip and then we'll talk a bit about it.
A key component of the American Jobs Plan is training our workforce. This is a reality. The changes in the American economy, many of which have been massively accelerated by COVID, are very scary for millions of Americans. It's a scary place to be, to need a job and not have the skills to get a good job. The fact of the matter is, in order to compete, we have to have investments in apprenticeships, community colleges, STEM education, job training. My view is, if you have the guts in the middle of your career to go out and get some job training, to retrain yourself to get a new job, then we need to be there for you to provide high quality, demand-driven, affordable, if not free, job training.
Okay, if workers have the guts. That's a pretty strong endorsement for workforce as part of the American Jobs Plan. What did you all see in America's Jobs Plan that was evidence of this commitment?
Well, I want to start with, I think the secretary made a really great point that it is a scary place as an individual to not have those skills. It's also really scary for a business owner to continue to not be able to find a qualified worker and continuing to have so many open jobs. Within the American Jobs Plan, there were some important priorities that really align with manufacturers' needs, such as a focus on apprenticeships. I know Tracy just touched on that, as well as work-based learning. Apprenticeships and work-based learning are really important tools that can be utilized to close the skills gap, and manufacturers have really been utilizing those and continue to expand into apprenticeships to grow their workforce. Also, the focus on increasing the amount of labs and technology to make sure that students can learn for jobs of the future. A huge issue in manufacturing is the perception challenge. And so having more students within schools have access to labs and technology to be able to learn about the jobs of the future is really important to manufacturers. And then also the focus on sector-based training and the specific call out to support and encourage more women and people of color to enter in-demand careers such as manufacturing. This has really been an important focus for us at the Manufacturing Institute, and we're really glad to see that included in the plan.
If I can, I want to jump in here after just what Cassie has just been mentioning. What I loved about what Raimondo was talking about is really highlighting individuals that are seeking to change up their skills, clean up their skills, advance their skills. And for what we saw just before the pandemic, or the reason why, in part, why the pandemic hit low income workers, African-American workers, and female women workers is because there was an over-index of them in those industries that were very vulnerable to this very economic tsunami. And what I love about upskilling and the investment and the promotion of it is that it gives an opportunity for those individuals to find a tangible pathway out of those jobs. Because what was unique and the reason why they were over-indexed is because they were easy. As I mentioned earlier, folks, African-Americans go for jobs that they readily see in their lives, and it's an easy job to get, but those jobs don't come with training, they don't come with benefits, they don't come with a career pathway out of it. And so and then also if you add in, as the economy comes back, a lot of those jobs aren't going to come back either, simply because we saw the devastation that occurred in the hospitality, the restaurant community, food services community itself. So we're going to find a large number of Americans needing jobs, but not having the skills in order to qualify for those jobs, but also need assistance, very quick assistance in order to find a pathway to those jobs. So I'm very excited about that part of the jobs plan and what Secretary Raimondo is supporting on it, because it really does touch at the heart of the American job seekers' needs.
I'll build on what Tracy said. I mean, it just resonates with me, right? 7 million jobs that may not come back like post-pandemic and all of those sectors that you just mentioned, yet we're going to invest in these other sectors that needed workers pre-pandemic and that will hopefully be booming post-pandemic. And so Congress has done a lot of good jobs talking about job creation in the past, but not a really good job of talking about how you train those workers to get into those jobs. We just haven't done that. And so I know I was just completely thrilled. The National League of Cities was thrilled to see like training in a bill, right? Investing significantly and to the scale that we need to, and how to get workers either into new jobs or like reskilled into better jobs, and to create those career pathways that, you know, we all have in our lives, you know, whatever the sector, to make sure that you start out in a job and you advance to the next one. And how do you get there, right? And that's those work supports. I think we've all learned during this pandemic that childcare is important. Transportation is important. Hey, guess what? Broadband is really important too. A lot of this training can be done virtually and technologically. And so investing in our broadband networks not only invests in infrastructure, but it enables people to get the training they need to do too. And maybe you do that from home. Maybe you work from home. So, you know, I think the recognition about how these things are intertwined is incredibly important to make sure that when these funds hit the ground in communities and local leaders are working with community colleges and post-secondary systems to try and get these funds on the ground, that there's money to actually connect the dots.
Yeah, for us, what's so exciting about the president's plan is that it clearly recognizes that Build Back Better means not just better physical infrastructure, it means better jobs and better and broader job quality and job opportunity. And I think this administration also understands that that does not always happen organically, that you actually have to be pretty intentional about it, that you need to support community-based organizations that are running pre-apprenticeship programs, right? That are preparing local residents to get into the construction trades, to actually qualify to get into a registered apprenticeship program so that they have that opportunity. It has to include local hiring incentives, right? So that the story that Tracy told about the dad pointing to the bridge, that actually happens, right? That there is a clear incentive for contractors to be hiring people from the communities where infrastructure projects are being built so that those community members can benefit from that project, but not just because it's a job, but because they're getting access to a career pathway. And it's a career that emerges from that as we begin to repair and rebuild this country. So we're really excited by this plan, and we are ready to work with members of Congress to get it across the finish line.
That was a perfect segue, Jason. Let's turn to Congress and what each of you need to see in a final package. We've talked about the potential for bipartisan support. We've talked about the energy that we see from the administration in moving something forward. But now the work goes to Congress. So what do you all need to see in a final package in order for this to meet the needs that we set out at the beginning of the conversation?
So there's a few that I would make recommendations. One, it's wonderful to hear and to see a commitment to diversity in workforce development, but we also need to include diversity of jobs. Oftentimes we do see of initiatives for hire, usually those jobs are for entry-level positions. And a lot of times those individuals, particularly in the tech sector, those individuals do not leave those entry-level positions, and they end up leaving the industry, which really doesn't really solve the need, right? The intention, the spirit of an initiative for diversity. There needs to be diversity and diversity job training initiatives for managerial jobs. There needs to be for specialist jobs themselves. So I really implore folks to really think much more deeply when we're talking about diversity and what it looks like. The second one, and this comes from our experience, the National Urban League sponsored about 4 construction jobs, both on the West Coast in California and also in Baltimore. And then, and we uncovered that best intended language and policy sometimes bad actors exploit loopholes. And so one in particular, and this affects small businesses mostly, is that particularly in California, they'll have a law policy or qualified applicants or grantees have to be locally based, meaning they have to be a local small business to qualify for a contract. But what we found are that large companies actually create LLCs in that city in order to skirt this provision for small business participation. And by doing it, it actually cuts out small businesses participating, which is really what you're intending for a community or a city, is to bring federal dollars to invest in your local economy. But you have these bad actors coming in and taking advantage of it. I would really strongly implore those policymakers, those who are really doing the research, to look at and be sure that folks are not taking advantage of the spirit of the law itself. My final one is that though it's not technically an infrastructure bit, it is definitely, we need to really address redlining and gentrification as we talk about rebuilding our cities. Nothing will kill the spirit of really revitalization as having individuals build up and renew their community, and then those individuals are pushed out of that community to go live someplace else. We need to have jobs that are sustainable, well paid. African Americans, Latinx communities need to be a part of this revitalization of middle class, including those jobs, but they have to be at home. They can't really be great. Thank you for your service. We're going to push you to the next place that's being underinvested. So that's super passionate about it. I think, paying attention to that helps keep us accountable to reason why we're adding diversity and why we want to honor that concept of the tide lifts all boats.
Creating pathways to long-term careers for people that live in the communities in which these infrastructure projects are being built.
I mean, I'll echo a lot of what Tracy said. And I think what that means is explicitly tying investments in infrastructure to standards, right? To ensure that we are creating high quality family sustaining jobs that are accessible. That means well-used standards like prevailing wage or project labor agreements or community benefit agreements or apprenticeship utilization. It means domestic content to make sure that we're actually building out manufacturing supply chains that supply all of the materials that go into infrastructure. Again, policymakers are going to have to be intentional, because unfortunately there are a lot of bad actors in our economy. We need to make sure that taxpayer dollars are supporting high road economic development and infrastructure recovery rather than low road.
I guess I'll just say yes to everything Tracy and Jason have said, but also, we want to make sure that there's funding for training, but we also want to make sure that it gets to the local level. Far too often it takes money a long time to wind its way from Congress to the states to finally to local governments or local providers that are on the ground getting the job done. And I think, ensuring that these funds make their way to the local level quickly, because we want to jumpstart the economy and rebuild from this pandemic. And frankly, the roads that weren't working before the pandemic. So I think for us, that intentionality of how and where the funds go is important, but also the significant number of the training, right? I mean, we want to train and invest in a good number of people, not just 20. So we need to meet that need, and I think that's something that we're going to be looking for in this bill too. There are 136 former local elected officials who currently serve in Congress. And frankly, we're depending on them to sort of articulate that voice about why this is so important to local economies and frankly, to our national economy. And sort of we're looking to hopefully see that significant investment in Congress. And we know this isn't to the first step, right? We are expecting an American Families Plan from the president after this, which are sort of multiple steps to that recovery plan. And so we're looking forward to seeing what comes in those bills too.
Yeah, so for us, we really want a focus on funding to help individuals gain skills in short-term programs There's so many credential and certification programs that displaced workers can take advantage of to enter into a manufacturing career. And so making sure that there's funding and supports to gain those credentials and certifications is really important to us. And then also we'd like to see a focus on work-based learning opportunities, which includes allowing manufacturers and other employers to defray some of those additional costs that are associated with these types of programs. And finally, we would like to see the ability for community colleges to be able to purchase equipment for this training. With more individuals entering training, there's going to be a higher need for more equipment within these community colleges, and manufacturing equipment's expensive. And without the ability for community colleges to purchase that, it's going to make training really difficult. So we'd like to focus on that as well.
Thank you all. I hear a lot of similarities in themes, and then as well as some of the conversations that Congress is going to be having about how to reconcile potentially some differences. What I heard many of you all talking about are pathways for people from entry-level jobs they could get through an infrastructure into good long-term jobs. Or you're talking about partnerships between the folks that are educating people who will fill these jobs at community and technical colleges, and the capacity at those community and technical colleges and community-based organizations, and connections to industry, the importance of working with employers who are going to be hiring workers in work-based learning and apprenticeship programs. And then something earlier from the conversation that I heard folks talking about was the scope of what infrastructure is, and ensuring that as we're talking about broadband and access to some of those that digital access and equity, that we're including the skills for people to be able to access and use that technology as well. So I want to give everybody one last chance to share any final comments or thoughts, underline anything that you think was particularly important in the conversation, or share any resources that your organizations may be putting forward on that link between the importance of infrastructure and investments in skills together, so that we prepare workers for a people-centered infrastructure that supports workers' access to skills that businesses are hiring.
So thanks a lot, Katie. I would like to uplift the National Urban League's recent announcement last week of the Latimer Plan. The Latimer Plan is the National Urban League's comprehensive investment of addressing the digital divide, and being that through supporting and investing in broadband, investing in training, whether it's for tech jobs or tech interfacing jobs, but those being targeted for low income, unemployed, underemployed workers. So folks can find that on the National Urban League's website under our social justice tab.
Thanks, Tracy.
And I'll just add, very thankful to be part of this conversation with this group. We're going into Infrastructure Month here in May, and so NLC has a series of sort of reports and fact sheets that we anticipate coming out, all centered around what we consider our 7 local goals for recovery legislation, which of course, investment in skills is a critical component of that. So we'd direct people to our website as well to check out those various resources and tools as they come out in the next 6 to 7 weeks.
The BlueGreen Alliance has a broad range of infrastructure priorities, and anyone looking at those will immediately recognize that we don't approach this narrowly, right? And so as this moves forward, there are some in Congress calling for infrastructure narrowly defined to mean only things like roads and bridges. That's important, of course. But we have water infrastructure, we have broadband, we have transmission grids. There is unfortunately a lot of broken things to repair in this country. And that sense of brokenness also extends to opportunity. So just keeping our eyes on the prize of making sure that as we build back better, that means creating high quality jobs and better opportunity for more Americans.
And thank you for having me, Katie. I would say if you go to the manufacturinginstitute.org, you'll see our workforce news and our upcoming events. We have a lot of great events coming up that really touch on a lot of the topics that we've talked about here today. So I'd love for the viewers to be able to go and join us for some of our events.
Thank you.
Katie, before I forgot one thing, but it's an invitation for everybody on this panel. June 16th and June 17th, the National Urban League will be hosting its annual legislative policy conference. It will be virtual and it will cover really hot button, really important issues such as voter rights, justice reform, and this very same topic as we talk about the infrastructure, particularly of broadband and technology and the digital divide.
Thank you. Cassie, Stephanie, Tracy, Jason, thank you for sharing your expertise, your insight, and thank you for joining us in today's conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Katie.
Thanks.
At National Skills Coalition, our work is grounded in building networks representing businesses, workers, colleges, community organizations, public officials, and advocates. We engage these networks to craft policy proposals and mobilize them to win concrete policy change. Our networks include SkillSpan, a set of state affiliate coalitions, Business Leaders United for Workforce Partnerships, comprised of thousands of small and medium-sized business owners and state affiliates, and Voices for Skills, tens of thousands of workers and grassroots skill advocates. Over the next few months, folks watching are going to be seeing calls to action to be part of advocacy to ensure that Congress lives up to the commitment made by the Biden administration to invest $100 billion in workforce development as part of our efforts to recover from the current crisis. I hope you'll check out nationalskillscoalition.org/people-centered infrastructure for more information on the campaign and for opportunities to engage with your members of Congress. Today, you can find a link on that page to send an email to your members, telling them to invest in workers' access to skills and supports necessary to ensure all workers can be part of an inclusive economic recovery and a people-centered infrastructure plan. Thank you so much for being with us today.